So I'm Ken Dychtwald, and I'm going to be answering questions for Global Leaders Views magazine in the order that they were sent, and I'll try to get through them all. So, first question has to do with what got me into this field in this place in the kind of in the first place. So I got involved. Let me start that again. So I got involved in working with older adults and in the field of gerontology kind of by serendipity. It was the early 1970s. I was living at Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California, and trying to build a notion as to what the relationship was between the mind and body, trying to fuse medicine and psychology. And writing my very first book, a book called Body Mind, which I'm glad to say got published a few years later and is still in print all over the world. Um, but sometimes serendipity plays a role in our lives. And I got invited to head up a year-long curriculum on human potential that was going to be initiated in Berkeley, California. And the extraordinary woman, Gay Luce, who was starting it up, had heard about me, and she knew that I knew a lot about yoga and meditation and Tai Chi and nutrition and all these various kind of emerging therapies, and asked if I would co lead this with her. And so I relocated to Berkeley, but there was a twist. Gay decided at the last minute that this year long curriculum, once a week meetings for 3 hours, and then homework assignments each day for each of the participants. We started with 16 participants, but she decided that she'd like to work only with older adults. Her mom had not been well, was battling hypertension, and Gay tried out some of the breathing and meditation and biofeedback techniques, and she got better. So my first reaction was, boy, I don't know about that. I don't see myself devoting my life to the study or field of aging, but I'll help you set the program up and we'll see where it goes. The long and short of it was that I became captivated by the older people. While living at Esalen, I came in contact with all sorts of modern gurus, from Ram Dass to Timothy Leary, Alan Watts, the work of Abraham Maslow, Will Schutz, a lot of people who were creating sort of the new frontier of psychology and, were seen to be wise individuals. But yet, when I was with these elders, I found them captivating. The idea of normal people who might not look hip and cool were nevertheless keepers of enormous wisdom and perspective. And it was their perspective that really captivated me. The idea of seeing one's life from 90 years, looking back and making sense of the regrets and the right decisions and the wrong decisions. And what kept striking me was that if you're a young person going with some friends going out on a camping trip, and there were some older people coming back from the same direction, you'd be smart to ask them what they saw. Were there any dangerous spots, any rattlesnakes to avoid, any beautiful sunsets or sunrises to capture? And what struck me was is that we were living in a society that was so youth focused, we weren't taking the time to probe and ask and learn from our elders. And that was what got me into the field in the first place. Initially, it was to teach them how to be healthier longer, but before long, it was them teaching me about kind of a life well lived. And I thought, how lucky am I at 24 to be learning these lessons before most people my age even thought of them? Second question: was there a defining moment? I'm about to sneeze. this this initial project, which we call the SAGE project, became very well known around the world. The media sort of fell in love with our elders doing Tai Chi and yoga, and it just sort of captured a moment in time. And I spent the next number of years setting up similar projects in different parts of the world. and being asked to speak at conferences and conventions about a new image of aging. And here I was, just a kid, um, speaking alongside folks like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was working on her death and dying theories, Ken Pelletier, who just written a book, Mind is Healer, Mind is Slayer. And I found myself sort of in the major leagues before I deserved to be. But then in 1982, the Office of Technology Assessment, which used to be the nonpartisan think tank of the US Congress, put together a 2-year study project, and I was invited to be a participant. There were about 20 of us, and I was clearly the youngest and least sophisticated of the folks on that team. And every month or so, we'd fly to Washington and spend a day or two discussing how America and the world would be different in the years to come as a result of the aging of the population. Now, that was a turning point for me because I had thought about aging as something individuals do. The idea of thinking about demography was new to me. And what I learned quickly was that the United States and most of the developed nations in the world were experiencing a declining rate of births. So a kind of a birth dearth was coming. And on the other side of the equation, there was a longevity elevation. And migrating across the lifeline was the baby boom generation, my generation, which at that point was kind of in their 30s, maybe looking at their 40s. But what I learned in this study project was that the time was coming where what looked to me to be an age wave was rising, that the center of gravity of our culture was about to shift from young to middle age and then old. And that would change everything, the way we design automobiles, the typeface in our printed materials, the auditory range in our telephones, the training of doctors, the products and services that fill the marketplace. So that was a massive turning point for me, the realization that there was what I called an age wave coming. It was not a boom, but it was a wave rising up, and it was going to transform our lives. Next, how do I identify ideas that are truly forward thinking and impactful? Well, I'd say that one of the mechanisms that I've used to work towards forward thinking ideas is to write books. To write a book, to sell a book, and then to have people buy the book, it's got to be new, it's got to be different. And I've written 19 books now. And every time I sit down to write a book, I have to stop and think whether it takes me a year or one of my books, Age Wave, which in some ways was my most successful book, took me 9 years. And I've got to kind of canvas the future. How will my subject, or whatever your subject might be, how will it evolve in the next 2, 5, 10, 20 years? What are the forces at play? What are the facts? What are other experts saying? And there are some experts that really like to hold on to the past, but there are some people, kind of futurists, who are trying to look around the bend and see what the future looks like. And I've always tried to line up with or interact with futurists, people who have the ability to think forward and lean forward. And then on top of that, I've been captivated by a handful of people who've come along in the course of my life who have the ability to motivate people to move towards the future. And a lot of people, I was trained along the way. I've got a doctorate in psychology. And I always used to think when I was a psychotherapist that most people want to feel and be different, but they don't want to change. Getting people to change is not easy. So you've got to be convincing, you've got to be persuasive, and you've got to be a little bit tantalizing in terms of presenting a future that they'd like to live in. Next, what role has curiosity played? It's interesting. There are different aspects of our lives that are given a lot of attention. I knew Steve Covey. He wrote a book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Effectiveness got a lot of airtime for a number of years. Um, Ambition, intelligence, um, connection, very powerful variables. But what I've always been intrigued by is curiosity, which, children have all over the place. And then as we grow up, we become more flattened out. There was a book I read years ago by a gentleman named Abbott, maybe it was from the 1920s or 30s, called Flatland. And it was about a world that was only 2 dimensions. So try to picture everything like on a blackboard. So everything either appears as a line or a dot, and you got to figure out who it is and what it is. And then midway into the book, Abbott introduces the idea of 3 dimensions. And it's kind of mind blowing because you can't imagine a 3 dimensional world. Same with us. We live in a 3 dimensional world, but we really don't easily imagine what's next. Curiosity is sort of this driving passion. It keeps you up at night. It causes you to reach out and find people who are particularly interesting. It causes you to read provocative books. It causes you to sit in on lectures by people who might be outside your field or even in your field, whose minds travel in different directions and have covered different landscape than you might be accustomed to. So I'd have to say that curiosity for me is one of the most important variables in life. In fact, my memoir, I was going to name it The Sorcerer's Apprentice, which is that little Mickey Mouse character from Fantasia that I always related to, who always wanted to be like the sorcerer and always got it wrong. And then my publisher said to me, "We're not going to name the book that." And I said, "Well, yeah, we are." And he said, "No, we're going to name the book What Your Life Is About." I said, "Oh, you're going to tell me what my life is about? What's that?" And he said, "Curiosity." So we named the book Radical Curiosity. And I said to him, "Well, everybody's curious." He says, "You'd be surprised. Most people are not. Most people just get through their days and do their job and live their life, and their curiosity never really sparks, never comes to life. For you, it's a driving force, and it's partly what makes people interested in you and your ideas, that they see that they're driven by your lifelong curiosity." Next question is, how has my approach to leadership changed over the years? I'd have to say that I've had a kind of a fortunate life because I found myself in a leadership role in my 20s. I'm now 76. So back in my 20s, my leadership, the media used to call me the Paul Revere of aging. The aging are coming, the aging are coming. My leadership was largely about telling people interesting things and hoping that they would agree or at least pay attention. Um, and then as I started building companies, my leadership style was sort of abrupt. It was immature. It was moody. As I've lived a little bit longer and as I've seen all four of my parents, my wife's parents and my parents pass away, as we've raised children. We now have a grandchild who lives in China with his mom and dad, my son and daughter-in-law. As I've seen the world go through all sorts of ups and downs, and some leaders turn out to be fake, and other leaders turn out to be more profound. By the way, the most extraordinary leader I've ever encountered was Nelson Mandela. I met Mr. Mandela at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland in the late 1990s, and I just never met an individual like him who didn't need to use a megaphone, didn't need to yell at people, didn't need to snarl. He just was thoughtful and powerful and kind. And I've tried over the years to become a little more grown up in my leadership style, a little bit more respectful of others, and nevertheless committed to what I believe and what I feel needs to be done in the world. And I want to underline that I feel that leadership is not just about getting up and praising yourself. It's about having a mission. It's about caring about something really important that the world would do well to pay more attention to. So my mission continues to get honed. My mission to help prepare the world for the aging of our society. And let me point out that throughout 99% of human history, the average life expectancy worldwide was under 25. So there have always been some 50 and 70-year-olds, but not very many at all. That always, throughout all time, we were essentially a world of young people. So now that this age wave is coming, that I referred to a little while ago, um, there's a lot of changes needed. Changes in how long we work, changes in how much we need to save, changes in how we reimagine ourselves. I had the good fortune decades ago of interviewing John Glenn, who I knew, who was a former astronaut turned senator, and decided to go back up to space at 77. And the young reporters were asking him, "Don't you think you're a little old for this? Shouldn't you be playing golf? Or, you're an old man, why not just kind of retire?" And he said, "Hey, Ken, just because I'll be 77 doesn't mean I still don't have dreams." And that really got me thinking, because I think in our youth focused history, you had dreams one time when you were young. And what Glenn was saying, and you either succeeded with those dreams, congratulations, or you didn't. Sorry about that. What Glenn was saying was is that in this new longer lived era, which has never happened before, you may have new dreams at 50. You may decide to change your careers at 60. You may decide you don't want to retire. You may find yourself, if you've been widowed or divorced, falling in love again. What is it to fall in love in your 60s? You might write your first book of poems when you're 90. You might become an entrepreneur at 85. And that's a world that needs some attention, the world of adulthood and what the possibilities are. And it's particularly important because the 20th century really became a century of youth obsession in the media, youth obsession in the marketplace, youth obsession even in the way we think about life. And so for me, being a so-called thought leader, trying to get people to realize that this is time affluence. This is a new stage of life, adulthood and late adulthood and elderhood, and even middlescence in the middle of life that we've really never had the luxury of experiencing before. And now we've got to figure out what to make of it. Um, can I share an experience where one of my ideas forced resistance, but later proved successful? Many decades ago, maybe around 30 or so years ago, I introduced the phrase healthy aging, which now is like massively popular. I actually did a book called Healthy Aging. Andrew Weil did a book on healthy aging. It's a phrase you hear all the time: healthy aging, healthy longevity. But when I first introduced the phrase, people in the aging field had a very negative reaction. They thought that I was blaming the victim, that if somebody was older and they were unwell, by referring to the idea that there is a choice to be healthier, it made it look like that they were not only victimized by a health problem, but now I was blaming them for it. And I just stayed steady. I just said, look, I was very influenced, frankly, by Abraham Maslow, who talked about deficiency orientation in psychology. And that also there was this kind of wellness side, this being orientation, that even if you were okay, you could continue to look to grow and expand and widen your views. And I thought the same should be true with regard to aging. Not only is there decline and then are there some problems that emerge, but also we see examples all around us of healthier, older people than we've ever imagined. And so when I introduce this phrase, healthy aging, I got a lot of pushback, but I held on, and now it's just sort of standard phrase. Everybody uses it. Next, what are the most common misconceptions people have about thought leadership? I think people think it's sort of a natural gift. You know, they see someone who is a thought leader who's written a book or is in the media or wins a prize of some sort, a Nobel Prize, a Pulitzer Prize, and they figure it comes easy to them. What I've learned is that those of us who are attempting to be thought leaders work hard. We work hard, first of all, in general. I mean, 50, 60, 70-hour weeks are normal for me, and they've been my whole life. I feel like in order to stay abreast of my subject and to keep pushing forward, to keep allowing the next chapter to unfold, I can't take this lightly. Second, I have tried to find out what my weaknesses are. For example, in this modern age, being an effective communicator is really important in being a thought leader. Maybe in another era, if you work for a university and you wrote a white paper, that got the job done. But now being able to handle yourself on podcasts, on webcasts, on TV shows, I've been on 60 Minutes, I've been on Oprah, I've been on almost every venue you can think of. And I have coaches. I get trained to do what I'm doing right now. And I'm always looking to get better. How do you tell a story better? If you're using multimedia, how to use the best multimedia? If you're trying to engage an audience, I found that the more senses you can connect with, the better. So if you can make them laugh, if you can make them cry, if you can make them remember, if you can make them stop and think, uh, and that requires not only telling great stories and showing great video clips, but also pausing and letting people see the future. I think that partly giving people a glimpse as to where you think we ought to head and then having them want to be a part of that is a critical part of being a thought leader. And I've learned that over the years, how to do that more and more effectively. How do I ensure my content and insights remain credible and well grounded? Even when I first started my company, my wife and I actually started the company together exactly 40 years ago. We had one employee to begin with, and she was a librarian researcher. I've always had research teams. I've always wanted to know what the latest thinking is, what the latest data is, what the best ideas are. I always base my work on truth and true data. You know, when you're being called into the White House or to the World Economic Forum to meet with world leaders, you can't make stuff up and, get your facts wrong and sort of think that that'll fly. You've really got to have your truths buttoned up. And they can't swing towards one political persuasion or another. They should be about the truth of your subject. They should be objective, and they should be. I'll tell you one story. Years and years ago in the 1990s, I was on vacation and I got a note from, it said the White House, President Clinton would like to know your thinking about the aging of America. So I put together a 25-page document and sent it off to them, and they got back to me and they said, sorry, we're going to reject this. Why is that? I said, it's too long. Too long? How long should it be? No more than 5 pages. I said, boy, how do you boil down everything I've ever learned into 5 pages and make sure that it's accurate? But I did it. You know, the thought of being a part of a presidential viewpoint was exciting to me. So I redid it, and then they rejected it again. And they said, the president is already familiar with some of these ideas. You've got to send him ideas that he's not thought of. And I thought, oh man, I've got to now study everything he's ever said or thought about the aging of America and come up with some ideas that are different than the ones he's already thought about. That was quite an exercise. Um, and ultimately, it was very engaging for me, and I hope for the president. Um, And I've been in situations like that repeatedly throughout my life where presidents of companies or leaders of fields have said to me, tell me some things about this age wave, but tell me some things that I don't know. I was brought in to meet with Nobuke Ide when he was the chairman of Sony, and he wanted to know how the aging of the population was going to affect his company. So we had a long, I remember there were bodyguards all over the room. We had a long discussion about that. I had dinner with Lee Kuan Yew, the senior minister of Singapore, and he was captivated by my work, and he wanted to know in what ways, this was 35 years ago, in what ways Singapore was going to need to change in order to deal with the aging of its population. And literally over dinner on napkins, we sort of drafted a plan. Give you another crazy example. I was asked to do a free consulting day for a friend of one of my investors. And I said, sure. So I flew to, none of my staff, just me. I flew to St. Louis and met with Augie Busch, the head of the Anheuser-Busch Company. And I gave him a briefing about how the whole world was going to be getting older, which he and his two sons and about 50 other executives were in the room. And they were not happy to hear this because that thought leadership was a bummer for them because as men grow older, their prostate glands get a little larger and they don't drink as much. And so they were bummed out. And I wasn't there to just tell them something they'd be happy about. I was there to tell them what I saw as the truth of this demography. Now, for some companies, like when we worked with Letterly and we came up with Centrum Silver, they loved it. That was big news for them, and it became $1 billion product within a year. Um, but back to the Anheuser-Busch folks, we're having lunch in the executive little dining room, and Mr. Bush, Augie Bush, said to me, should we start a new brand from scratch? The 50-year-olds like beer. I said, sure, they like it, but starting a brand from scratch could cost 50 or $100 million, and it may flop, in which case, where are you? So he turned to one of his sons and he said, do we have any brands that are kind of dead, but the brand would be something that 50-year-olds would be familiar with from their growing up years? And his son said, well, there's Michelob, but it's not worth anything anymore. And he turned to me and he said, what would you do with Michelob? And I said, I'd take down the calories, take down the carbohydrates, and I'd double the price. He said, would you call it Michelob Light? I said, no, nobody wants to hold up a light beer when they're checking out of a supermarket or they're at a bar. I'd call it Michelob Ultra, which became the most successful beer relaunch in history. So, um, knowing your facts, knowing your market, and for me, having had the good fortune of having our company work in the automotive industry, the pharmaceutical industry, healthcare, financial services, each field that you work in, you learn a little bit. And there's crossover to other fields. And it's made us all a little bit smarter. And being viewed as sort of the leaders on this age wave subject, we usually get called into the corporate boardroom and we get to meet with some very interesting and extraordinary people. And I've often said to them, I'll tell you what, I'll teach you what I know about the age wave. You, Mr. Gerstner, he was running American Express at the time, Lou Gerstner, you teach me what you know about running a business. He went on to run Archer Nabisco, brought us along, and then he went on to run IBM. And they loved it. You know, when I was working for Iacocca, he loved teaching me what he had learned about working with dealers and manufacturing, and he loved taking what I was learning about demography and the family and from all sorts of different projects. So you make that exchange. Um, Next question. What role have mentors played in shaping your professional journey? Big. I don't see how anybody can want to be excellent at what they do or be a thought leader without 3 to 5 mentors or more. And some mentors, you know, stay with you for years. In the aging field, my two primary mentors were Dr. Robert Butler, who had started the National Institute on Aging and was MD, and really was the father of modern day geriatrics. And quite different from him was a woman named Maggie Kuhn, who was the founder of the Gray Panthers, and she was referred to as America's wrinkled radical. And so having these two people who were kind of enthusiasts for me and what I was trying to do, but would give me guidance and nourishment. And when I was feeling like it wasn't worth the fight and things weren't going right, they would shore me up. Mentors are really important. And by the way, people like being mentors, I've learned. I mean, I mentor dozens of young people now, and it's enjoyable for me. And I think I feel about it like sort of paying it forward. So many folks have mentored me over the decades, um, that I feel like it's appropriate and enjoyable to mentor young people back. So I'm a big believer that mentors, whatever you might have learned when you were growing up or in college or in your early work years, great. But throughout your life, if you see somebody who is doing something or doing something in a way that you feel you could benefit from knowing more about, ask them if they would be open to mentoring you. And it might be once a month or once a week or on Zoom call, or it might be reviewing some of the things you've written or thought. And, you give them some guidance. I want to be told the truth. I want to be made better. I want to be, as wise as you. And people will lay it on you. Next question. How do I balance innovation with practical real world applications? Well, you have to, or else your game is over. I've learned in writing books that if there's no innovation in them, people won't read them. And if there's no real world applications, it's just fanciful insights. Um, there's a fellow named Malcolm Gladwell who I know just a little bit, who's written these very simple books, Blink or whatever. And it's a little bit of provocation with a novel idea, and then it's some examples of how to make it work. And so it's the combination of the innovation, innovative idea, innovative thought, and here's an example of that taking place, or here's how you might be able to do it in your workplace or in your community or in your family. And it's the combination of the innovative idea and the action steps to making it happen. My wife, Maddie Dychtwald, has written 4 books, and her last book became a national bestseller last year. It's called Ageless Aging, a woman's guide to increasing health span, brain span, and lifespan. She found that all the books about longevity and wellness in the later years of life had been written by men, and she felt it was time that a woman put her voice into the discussion. And she spent 4 years interviewing, she's not a doctor, experts all around the world. And what she found, first of all, the book was, she gets thousands of emails and notes from people saying it changed her life. So I'm incredibly proud of her. Um, but she found that if she just put facts in there about, your ovaries or about hormones or about peptides, people might glance at it. But putting in real stories of people who had had their lives transformed, and then putting in what she called hacks. Here's 5 things you can do to make a difference in each chapter, uh, was the winning combination. And I think she's right. It's a combination of interesting insights and also what you can do about them. I'll tell you one other little example from that. When I was a young man, I uh, met a couple that were living in the Boston area that were trying to do an Esalen type human potential center. His name was Jack. Her name was Judy. I hadn't seen Jack for decades. And maybe 30 years ago, I bumped into him at a conference and I said, "How you doing?" He says, "My focus is on self-esteem. People keep asking me for a book about all the things I talk about in my lectures." And I said, "You mean that they want the studies and the facts and the statistics?" He said, "No, they want the stories. But I can't find a publisher who will publish just people's stories." And I've been turned down by over 140 publishers already. I said, "What are you thinking of calling the book?" And he said, "Chicken Soup for the Soul." It was Jack Canfield. And he did find a publisher. They've sold 500 million books so far. Stories, really important in being a thought leader. You can't just talk about facts or figures or even examples. You've got to put real human interest into it with stories about real people, lessons you learn. What challenges have I faced while trying to bring new ideas to the forefront? I'd say almost anything you could think of. I was launching all sorts of businesses in the 1990s and raising capital from investors when all of a sudden this thing called the internet came along, and nobody wanted to invest in things that were not internet related. Didn't expect that. I've had employees who have lied to me or have stolen from me. Never expected that. I've had companies try to steal my intellectual property. When you're a little company and a big company comes along and tries to take it away from you, never expected that. I've had my own aging process. Hey, here I was, the 25, 30-year-old guy talking about the age wave, and now I'm in my mid 70s. Silly as it sounds, I never really knew what it would feel like to be older yourself and have your friends be, I feel like it's a game of dodgeball, have your friends be getting hit and hurt by illness and disease and dying. Good friend of mine just died this past week. It's sad. Um, it's frightening. Going to the doctor every year is frightening. You don't know what they're going to find. Fortunately, I've been healthy. I've had a few little run-ins with health problems, but I've handled them. I work out twice a day and I keep a good body weight. And my wife and I eat an extremely healthy diet. We try to steer clear of all inflammatory substances, from red meat to gluten to refined foods. Um, but there's lots of things that can trip you up and cause you to be less of a thought leader. And I've picked a subject that people are increasingly holding me as an example of. So when I was a young guy talking about those older people, it was different. Now people look at me and look at how I'm living my life and evaluate whether or not I'm staying true to my own principles, which I am doing, but it takes work. Um, I'd say the biggest challenge that we face in the thought leadership game is competition. I remember every time I'd put out a book, I'd be in the green room at the Good Morning America office studios or other programs, and the new hot authors and the new hot subjects would come along. And they're intimidating. When AI first appeared on the scene a few years ago, would anybody even want to hear about our subject? So I adopted it to be able to be inclusive of AI. When people wanted to know about generations, that became a more prevailing theme than just the older generation. Um, so competition, or even just a great speaker. Maybe somebody comes along in my own field who's terrific, or has written an extraordinary book, or who has got a great affiliation with a company or a university. And you're always in competition with all these other folks. And I just lean in a little harder and work a little harder and try to be even better at what I do. How do I stay adaptable and open to change in an ever evolving global landscape? It's hard. It's hard. There, the speed with which we talk about the speed of it for a second. It used to be that, when Alvin Toffler wrote Future Shock in 1970, he talked about there would come a time in the future where change would happen so fast it would shock people. I think we're in that now. The speed with which geopolitics, every time I turn on the news, it's like another story from 4 hours before. The technologies are ramping up. If I was a 20-year-old, what would I want as a career, knowing that AI was going to eat up a lot of the careers? Um, maybe do a better job. Um, Speed of change. Um, got to be prepared for that. Got to keep your eyes and ears open. Got to find some, let's call them mentorns, a phrase that Chip Connolly made up. Where I'm not only mentoring, but I'm being mentored back by younger people. I've got a 15-year-old mentee that during COVID, it was set up through a company called Eldera for me to mentor her once a week. She lives in Brooklyn. And along the way, she was 10 then, she's 15 now. She's been teaching me all sorts of things about technology and young people. And a couple of weeks ago, I actually flew back to New Jersey and gave a speech at my high school where I hadn't been for 59 years. And all those young kids were telling me what was going on in their world. And it's like, wow. Um, I had a lot of listening and learning to do. So remaining adaptable gets harder. You get a little bit more set in your ways and a little bit more of a believer that you know what you're talking about. And you may be missing out on all sorts of new technologies or new ideas or new feelings or new worries. So you got to keep your mind and your heart open to all of that. Then, last question. What advice would I give to aspiring professionals who want to become impactful thought leaders? I'd say several things. First, pick a subject that's not crowded. I was fortunate. I picked the field of aging, in which there were very few other people trying to make a name for themselves or make an impact on the world. And rising to the top of that field was a lot easier than had I picked a subject where there were 500 other aspiring thought leaders. So pick a subject, pick a field where you can really stand out. Next, do some homework on what aspect of that territory will be provocative and important to people, not just you. A lot of folks think that thought leadership means I'm going to talk about what I find interesting. I have found that the reception is more important than the transmission. Letting people know things that they're interested in, that'll pique their curiosity, that'll drive them forward, oddly makes you a better thought leader. Hone your communication skills. You can never get good enough. And it's in all media now. It's whether it's on Zoom. I gave 250 keynotes during the COVID era on Zoom. I built a studio in my office and I would do 2 or 3 a week. I didn't have to go anywhere, didn't have to put any shoes on. Of course, it was weird. I didn't have people to react to what I was saying, but I had to learn new communications talents and techniques on this device versus if I have a room of 20 people or if I have a room of 5,000 people. Um, Communication skills. And I would last say, get feedback. Get feedback. A lot of people do their attempt at thought leadership, but it doesn't fly. And so if I give a talk or I do a workshop or I write an article and people say, oh, I saw your talk, I'll always say, what struck you about it? what did you like about it? Or somebody sees me in the airport and they say, aren't you the age wave guy? I heard you speak maybe a decade ago. I said, what do you remember? And I'm always learning what of the things that I have to share are making the biggest impact. And I double down on them. And the things that people forget about, I drop away. Um, and don't lose heart. Maggie Kuhn once said to me, she was the woman from the Grey Panthers, be prepared to give your talk or your presentation 1,000 times before people get it. I think of that probably every week, you know, when will my work be done? And it's not done yet. I still keep writing articles and books and giving speeches, and I get called in to advise companies and governments, and it's far more advanced than it was decades ago, but the work is not done being a thought leader. Hope that answers some of the questions. I'm going to close this off now and then send it over.